I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Welcome, everyone, to Arcane Mark, converting between tabletop RPGs. Today's topic is an interesting one. I've had definitely a lot of people asking about it. Specifically, a lot of people ask about like 5th edition D&D and Pathfinder 2nd edition. Mm-hmm. But there's also just a lot of times that you might convert between tabletop RPGs that are not those two. Sometimes tabletop RPGs that are even much more different, because as much as there are differences between 5e and PF2, there are a lot of similarities. So I promised on Twitter that we have like one major principle that will drastically assist you in converting between tabletop RPGs, and we absolutely do. By the way, a hype train is active.
Thanks for the cheer, Numbat.
So the principle, I'll just tell you at the beginning so that you know what it is, and we'll put that into practice as we talk about converting and field any questions from chat of any of you who are in the process of converting or have a question about conversion. So that principle is out the door. Forget about a one-to-one literal conversion. Even if it's a really similar system, just don't try to do that. Instead, what I want you to do is take whatever it is that is awesome. Take what is precious that you really want to convert to you, right? And I want you to try to, like we do in all of our workshop episodes of Arcane Mark, figure out like what is the most important part of that concept. What is at its essence? What carries the theme? What has emotional impact?
Like, for example, let's say that you have an ability in a game that's like, okay, yeah, you know, this allows you to move faster, and then at the end of your move, then you gain like a +2 bonus on your attack roll or whatever. Like the concept of that isn't, you know, that you got a +2 bonus or that like, you know, your movement speed increased by 10 feet or whatever.
Look, I'm not gonna judge. It might be. I'll give another example that's on the same line as what Linda was saying. Let's suppose you had a character in D&D 5e that was a warlock. Okay? So, for some people, the main part of that concept, I think, honestly, for most people, might be that they have a weird patron who has demands of them, and there's this contract that they made with them, and it's kind of sketchy. And for that regard, if you're converting to Pathfinder 2nd edition, a witch might be a good conversion, because they also have a mysterious patron. Yeah. But for some people, maybe it is the +2 bonus on Linda's example.
I do want to go back to what I meant by that.
Maybe it is the fact that they can spam spells, and so maybe a witch is not exactly what they want to play.
Yeah, what I was saying is that even in that concept, like the fact that the bonus is the +2 isn't really what's important about that. The concept would be, you know, like a mobile striker or something like that, rather than like, oh, the bonus has to be exactly this in that system.
For someone, it might be.
But you're saying it might be,
it's going to be very rare.
But also, like, part of the reason I said, like, the +2 bonus is because, like, something in D&D that gives you, like, a +2 bonus, you definitely wouldn't want to pull that over into Pathfinder and say, oh, it still gives a +2 bonus.
5e probably would have given you advantage, which you even less want to get with Pathfinder.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it's not so much the specific mechanical expression, but rather, like, what is the feeling of playing this, and what is the part of that feeling that really speaks to you?
For at least like 80 to 90% of players, it's going to be about the story and the narrative, which was what Linda was getting at with that example. But I think the warlock example gives you a sense that there are going to be players for whom some mechanical minutia is actually really, really important to them, and you might not be able to predict it. So you could just ask, if you're a GM, you can ask your player, when they're converting their character, what was most important to you about this character? What really sings to you about this character? And then that is how you can use to convert. So, for example, if they said, I want to be able to use my my like Eldritch Blast type things, and I want to be able to use spells or magic powers over and over again, and you can say, well, Witch does have a single cantrip, and they say, yeah, but I want a bunch of stuff. So then you might want them to play actually a kineticist or an elemental avatar. But if they're like, wait a minute, that's weirdly, those are both like elemental powers. That's not exactly what I want. I want the mysterious patron. which I think most people will, then which is probably a better bet for them.
Yeah. And, the more similar the game systems are, the easier it is to do those sorts of things. Because, there may be something that's about, there may be like that, if you're converting over to a system that just doesn't even have a concept of spamming spells in it at all, because it's a system where it's like, magic is rare by default.
Every time you use it, something bad could happen.
Then like that kind of concept is not gonna gel as well.
But you might get the mysterious patron feel in that system very well. And thanks for the gift subs, Altro and the cheer Numbat. We beat level 2 of the hype train so far. Lava Being says they've seen multiple posts online about GMs wanting to exclude specific content from a system because it doesn't fit the genre that they're thinking of running. If they want to go very low magic fantasy or very hard sci-fi, and they've got a setting that's like sort of in the between. Absolutely.
Yeah, so for sure. And that's whether you're converting or using an existing system, you totally can do that to help enhance the feeling of the story and the theme.
I think we had an early episode somewhere
attempting to adapt
playing subgenres.
Adapting new content to fit the new genre, absolutely. Like, if you have something that's like, well, this is a laser gun, but we don't want laser guns in this kind of thing. You could totally say, okay, well, we're gonna take the statistics for the laser gun, but we're going to retheme this as like, a magical artifact that then instead shoots fire.
Right.
So that you can use the mechanics, but put a different spin on them.
Yes. So I want to go back to inquiring with your players, figure out what they find to be the most important conceptual element of a certain thing that you're trying to convert. And like I said, it's probably going to be the narrative, like the mysterious patron. It might be some of the more mechanical specifics. You might find a player who is like, well, it needs to be called Warlock and have a patron and have an Eldritch Blast ability that's called Eldritch Blast that does this exact amount of damage. And at this point, like, that they've gone into that litany, you find that particular player is not engaging with your conversion attempt in a good faith effort.
And maybe that player isn't interested in playing the new system.
Yes, they probably aren't, and you might not be able to convert at that point. I know I gave an example of Warlock and 5e and PF2, but this is for any two systems. It's just that I find Warlock to be a fascinating example because a lot of people who are converting are thinking about Warlock, and it shows that there are two or more than two different kinds of things that people might care about their old character. Yeah.
But you could do this kind of thematic conversion for a lot of systems too. There might be the more different the systems get, the more like the power and the feel might be really different. Like just to think of two systems, like the Changeling system versus like Pathfinder, for example, where you might have something where it's like, oh yeah, I have a power that just lets me like erase everyone in the world's memory about this particular thing. Like, that's not something that you're necessarily going to be able to convert over, but that's part of an overall power set that's called chicanery and is about trickery. So you could convert that by saying, I'm going to have somebody who specializes in illusions and enchantments or things like that to get those sorts of themes over.
I want to convert my character from Mythender to Call of Cthulhu. Mythender to Call of Cthulhu. How can I do that? My character in Mythender killed Thor and Loki. So I want to have powers that could kill Cthulhu in Call of Cthulhu as well.
Well, I think that you might...
What should I do, Linda?
So I think you'd probably have a character who thinks that they can kill Cthulhu. And his research...
part of the concept was that I killed Thor and Loki and Cthulhu is next.
Yeah, okay.
I'm okay with being tainted and, like, having my mind warped by Cthulhu, because that already happens in Mythender when you're fighting these deities, and it could be an issue. But,
yeah, I think then you would look at what Thor and Loki are conceptually in that setting, and, like, place Cthulhu as something much more powerful, and then your character is like, oh, yes, I killed these beings called Thor and Loki. I could definitely defeat Cthulhu.
No, but in Mythender, it was a real deity that I defeated.
Yeah, obviously,
I know I went from a super strong character to, like, some of the weakest characters in Call of Cthulhu.
Yes.
Where you just lose
you
to
just
all the supernatural monsters. It looks like disposable henchmen, if they don't convert games, then shoves their hand into their torso, assimilating them with corruptive black ichor.
That's an arcade failure. I wouldn't recommend that with your players. That's not very nice. But back to where we were though. That was quite the mental image. I lost my train of thought.
There we have it. Oh, we got an emoji.
Oh, cool.
We got all of the level 2 emojis.
Looks like we have collected them all.
Oh.
Alrighty. Yeah, so I was talking about, like, you know, with very different systems, how the power may be part of the theme and you may not necessarily be able to replicate that as well, but you can still do something that's in that theme. You know, I find that you can definitely have characters who are like, oh yeah, you know, I have like kind of like a white mage or healer type character, and I always call them this, and they can retain that theme more easily than something that's like, oh, this is about this specific ability. Yeah, how would you convert content when the power levels of the system barely overlap? Could you start players at level below 1 or really high above the normal maximum?
Okay, so let's actually think about Call of Cthulhu and Mythender. So in Mythender, like, the only thing you do, it's an indie RPG by Ryan Macklin, and the only thing you do is that you fight like some manifestations of a particular deity for a warm-up fight, and then you fight that deity, and then you may have been corrupted by that deity to become the next Thor, and you might not have, depending on how much power you needed to draw on. So, and then you go to the next chapter where you do the same thing, and there's like an in-between where you deal with mortals and you may accidentally terrorize them, because you yourself have become a little bit more than a normal human by defeating and destroying and ending all these myths.
So I think both of the systems have a common theme of like corruption and ruination and loss itself.
Yes, they do have that. But I don't think there's a way to make a Mythender character that starts below the beginning amount, because it's already... Yeah. Your investigator from Call of Cthulhu would already be able to end myths. Even if you try to flavor it as they're in over their head and they don't know what's going on, maybe you can have a crossover event where they like absorb the powers of an elder sign and gain like additional abilities right as they're then catapulted into the Mythender campaign where they're Cthulhu-like deities. Because you can do... Norse is the default, but you can do any kind of pantheon. I know that, like, John Compton has run Golarian Mythender, where people ended, like, Shellen or Asmodeus or something like that. Or no, did they end Zon-Kuthon?
I think that is Zon-Kuthon,
And he had one of his, like, regalia that he used was Shellen, where he would just hold up Shellen as a shield to
that was it.
Defend himself or something like that. But anyway... you could do that and be like, yes, now because of this power you absorb, you could have a power-up event. It's like, now you are able to actually stop these elder deities.
Yeah, it's easy. I would say that it's generally easier to look at the really high than the really low, because you might be able to skew toward like, okay, yeah, we're going to represent this by playing at level 20 or something that's like at the top power level of that system. Whereas once you're getting below what the system even can handle, it's like, well, how would you do below level 1 and what would you do for like substantially below level 1?
PF2 has rules for...
Yeah, I mean, you could go like level 0, but if you're
Game
trying
Mastery
to
has two versions of level 0, one of which is even worse than the other one. So...
But that's not really like that much weaker if you were trying... But I guess like how much weaker on a power scale would you
Also, the problem is when with the examples that we gave with like Mythender, like ultimately... you're still not going to be enough weaker that it makes sense, so you might as well just have a power-up event.
Yeah.
And similarly, in the other direction, what you could do if you wanted to change your Mythender characters into Call of Cthulhu is have the character, maybe they failed the check against the corruption, so they normally would turn into Thor, and then you offered them sort of like a... Bleeds in the Dark style devil's bargain of the GM, where it's like, instead of turning into Thor, what if your character got depowered down significantly and lost what that spark was that could let them actually fight the divine? But now we're going to run a Call of Cthulhu game where instead of like Cthulhu mythos monsters, it's Norse creatures that are constantly killing you and you can't deal with. And your character is just weak, but the gods still don't like you, and they're sending things after you, and you've wound up, like, in the modern world doing these investigations with, like, weird, like, Norse corruptions. and everyone else are regular investigators, and they don't know that you like fell from Mythender, but everything's after you.
Yes.
So you could sort of bring the story together, but you need to come up with like an excuse, because there's literally no way you're going to be able to convert it without coming up with an excuse for why you're in the system, because there's nowhere even close to the beginning of Mythender that is anywhere close to the end of Call of Cthulhu. They just don't even come close to overlapping.
Yeah. I see another question. What would you suggest for a class to be something in between Cleric and Druid? I looked at both in PF2, but I couldn't get it. So I think it depends on what you mean by somewhere in between Cleric and Druid. So first
of all, are we trying to convert a specific in-between Cleric and Druid option from another RPG? Or is this just sort of a side tangent question of like, what if I wanted to make a new class that was between Cleric and Druid?
Because Cleric and Druid have two different flavors of magic. I wonder, like, what is it?
Primal versus divine.
Yeah. So what is it about the idea that, like, and you could have, like, a cleric with a druid multi-class or vice versa.
I would suggest a cleric with the nature domain and the druid multi-class as a pretty solid, and they both use wisdom. And so, like, if all you were doing is you're converting a character from another tabletop RPG who was somewhere in between, that character is going to feel very in between, even though they technically have the cleric class. They're going to have a ton of spells. They'll be good on their DCs because they both use wisdom. And I think that it's going to be okay.
I could also see playing, like, that would hit the theme a little more clearly. I could also see, like, if you wanted to focus on, like, oh yeah, well, I want to do primary druid because I want to have more of, like, an animal companion or whatever, or I want to have more, like, druid type stuff. I guess then you might possibly go more into, like, the, I am one of the types of druids that's a little more into the spell casting, and I have as a theme for my character that my character is very religious, and I often prepare, like, kind of spells that are both on the divine and spells that are on both the divine and primal list, because then you have both of them.
And also another way that you could do it with cleric if you want an animal companion is like Beastmaster.
Yeah.
So it's from a homebrew D&D 5e class called a shaman. So I would say that you should maybe just make a shaman that is not meant to be just between a cleric and the druid, but look into like real world shamanism is definitely spiritual, like you said. But the thing is, in Pathfinder, the druid is not a very spiritual essence class because they have faith in the natural world instead of in like spirits and those kind of things. Now, because of the idea of spirits of nature, like the word spirit is used like everywhere, and so that's why in the Essence treatise on Secrets of Magic, the author was like, maybe we should call the nature ones vitae because they're life force essence. But it's possible a shaman class could get very much into somewhere that is strongly divine, because it is. It's just from it's more associated with like non-Western cultures, but also that very, very spiritual and does some spiritual things that you might associate a little bit with some of the occult classes, and have some things that you might associate a little bit with druid or primal.
Yeah, particularly when you look at occult classes,
but
and
only
things
a
like,
little.
Yeah, a little bit, but it will probably be more like the things like, things that involve like speaking with haunts or like object reading or other things that are about like seeing beyond the mundane.
That's right.
To uncover truths that may not be like so easily put into little boxes.
That's true. So I would say that like if you're trying to play a shaman in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, just like maybe eventually a shaman class will come out. Like I know that there's been teasing about it from some of the people at Paizo of like something that they would want to do eventually.
I like that suggestion there. An oracle with some kind of like a nature or plant themed curse.
Potentially for a cleric / druid combination.
Yeah.
For a shaman, I think
it's not for shaman, but
for
the
shaman and oracle with like ancestors curse. But you could say it's not just my ancestors, but all of the spirits that are around.
Yeah.
That are the ones crowding me out, telling me what to do. The spirit that's in the tree and the spirit of an ancestor and the spirits from, because for shamans in a lot of cultures. Everything has a spirit except possibly certain like dangerous monsters from those traditions that are like, this is dangerous because it has no spirit. can't see ghosts, like a Kushtaka,
Mm-hmm.
for example. So an Oracle definitely could be a solid choice for that in conversion. So think about how we just did this conversation here, including Disposable Henchman's idea in chat. We didn't just say, okay, I need this to do mechanically the same thing as the homebrew D&D 5e class. We step back to the high concept and like, what are we thinking about with a shaman? Are we trying to tie into like real world shamanic traditions in a way that is going to express them the way that they normally appear, as opposed to just like sort of just using that name and just throwing it on whatever mechanics we have?
Mm-hmm.
Or was it it could be that the case that some of the mechanics in that D&D 5e class were the most important, like I was saying at the beginning, and that you would be willing to change the name from shaman to something else that's more appropriate for it and stick with that mechanic. And so you need to find what's most important to you and then use that to figure out what you're going to do.
That's a great question. Thanks for asking that. It gave us a good chance to go through and try that in practice.
Absolutely. So, like, ultimately, you're going to be more satisfied. Your players are going to be more satisfied if that's the way that you approach conversions. And that means there's not a one-size-fits-all approach because your group's going to be different than our group. And you might have a group where literally everyone is just like, no, the +2 that was at the end of the movement is the only thing that mattered. If it was 3, which is more, or 1 that was less, it still wouldn't feel the same as a 2. And, like, this seems weird. I see Linda making a face, but, like, there are people for whom that matters.
Okay.
And it's actually there's some of the hardest people to get things to work, but you might be able to be like, okay, but you didn't have to move first at a +10 foot speed to get it, right? It was the +2 that mattered, and then it was kind of said it was like a charge, right? And they were like, yes, that's what matters. So then you can be like, okay, well, what about in this system that's a D100 based, and you get a +2 on the D100 on a charge, and they might be like, yeah, because it's a +2.
Or like, you know, maybe something that to speak of actions, for example, maybe it's like, oh yeah, well, you can do this thing with one action in some other system, but it's more powerful in another system, so you can do it with more actions or with more setup or with more other stuff. So it's not like the thing you always go to, but it's a rarer thing that you might be able to do.
Yep. Or if you're just homebrewing something, it could have a frequency too, where it's just like once every 10 minutes you do this thing that's like a power rush or something like that. It's got your +2. So there's a lot of options that you can use, especially if you're willing to just like kind of homebrew player-based content. But like when you're converting monsters, think about what makes this monster cool. What makes them scary? What makes them so people are about the monster?
Yeah, you know, you wouldn't be like necessarily, yes, you know, the thing that's scary about this poison is that it can do
it is DC 27.
It is DC 27 and it inflicts the drained condition at whatever rate with its poison aura, but you might be like, you know, a poison that weakens a poison that saps the body's vitality or something like that might be a concept that you would stick with.
Disposable Henchman says cold aura. That's what makes it cool.
There you go. I mean, cold aura is something you could do in a lot of systems.
Absolutely.
Easily, so.
But like, yeah, you want to make sure you keep whatever makes it interesting.
Or like,
so
you know,
here's another example of a poison conversion. Like, I was trying to convert the poisons from Pathfinder 1 to Pathfinder 2, some of them, using a system for poisons that Stephen Rodney McFarland had come up with overall for afflictions. And I was like, okay, but there's some that we haven't converted. So I was looking at them and I was like, what makes like King's Tears, one of the most expensive poisons, cool? It's like, okay, what makes this poison cool is just that it lasts over a really long term, so you could be poisoning the king secretly and nobody finds out about it until later, and that like it very slowly, and it seems like a disease. That's what makes it cool. It doesn't matter exactly what it does other than that. So I need to make sure that it works on a disease-like scale, that it has a specific thing that people will mistake it for the progression of a disease.
Yeah. One other thing I was thinking about too, because I'm now still thinking kind of about Changeling, which is a World of Darkness system, versus Pathfinder, to have some things that are more different. Well, because in that you have the concept of like aggravated damage, which is like super hard to heal and things like that. And if you try to convert over to Pathfinder, like all of these types of damage are super hard to heal. Like whereas Pathfinder had, even you could totally
use vile damage from the 3.5 Book of Vile Darkness, which was just like it could only be healed in a sanctified church or something like that.
Or some of the things have the thing where it's like, you know, someone needs to like succeed at a counteract check to heal you, or the medicine
like
DC
Clay Golem or Barbazu's Infernal Wounds.
So you definitely can do that, but this made me thinking about sort of the prevalence of certain effects, because those types of things feel generally in Pathfinder like those should be rarer, unless you're going to construct your entire game around that.
Whereas
idea.
in Changeling, fire like any fire damage, fire or electricity.
Yeah. So considering the prevalence when you convert as well, just because you could come up with a way to switch it over doesn't mean it's not going to have broader.
Yeah, you probably don't want to give the Barbazu Cursed Wound ability onto all fire and electricity damage. That would be pretty rough. For everybody.
But you could, for example, have a monster that in this sort of crossover idea that slips over between worlds, and then they have that, and it's like, oh my gosh, their fire is like this really nasty fire, or that sort of thing, to hammer home the danger.
That's right. So, Disposable Henchman says, from what I understand, the theme and general feel is what you want. If something has an ability, you have to know it could fit in the new system. Does it need to be toned down? If it does not fit, how do you make it feel the same? Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
You want the feel to feel right. You want it to be something that's like, yes, this makes me feel like I'm engaging with what I'm doing in the other system. That was something I liked about the Pathfinder Adventure card game, is that there were just interesting ways that you dealt with like your character decks that made you feel a little bit like the character classes you were supposed to be.
Yeah.
Like the fighter class in that game had a hand that they would just like reveal cards from a lot of the time and just keep going, not using up their cards, not using up their daily resources. And they like, but there were other classes that were stronger, but would like have to discard out of their hand.
Yeah, and like the wizard, when they cast a spell, would generally discard it, whereas like the sorcerer might put it back on the bottom of their deck.
Yes. The sorcerer put it on the bottom of their deck, but they didn't have as many spells. The wizard had like a whole bunch of different spells. But they would probably only cast it once because it got discarded, whereas the sorcerers would be used multiple times.
And in that game, too, like a large hand size represented having few hit points, because the more cards you have in your hand, generally the easier it is for you to get walloped for a lot. Whereas like a small hand size with some good defensive abilities would represent being tanky. And
but it gave you fewer options.
Yes.
Whereas the wizard and sorcerer class in the RPG have fewer hit points and have more options. So there were a lot of like interesting small choices that help convey the feel. And that's what you're going for when you're converting tabletop RPGs. If it feels wrong to your players and to you, then the conversion is not going to work.
Yeah.
And if you just try to be like, get everything down to the exact detail, chances are you're going to make a conversion that's not as effective as
either going to be
right.
It's either going to be like, you know, not quite gel with the mechanics of the system, or it's going to be too powerful or not powerful enough to feel worthwhile.
Yes. And it just might be like, oh, I got it to gel, it took hours, it's basically the same, and it just still might not feel right though when you compare it to everything else. So you're definitely trying to convey the concept, the feel, and the narrative. So the story of that creature remains as close as possible, given the fact that game mechanics themselves alter the story of their world, because they're sort of like the world's physics change.
Yeah, so it's like, you know, what powers and abilities are available to the players, and, you know, how likely are those sorts of things to succeed. Because a lot of things can be changed by the setting, but those are the things that I consider generally to be the more mechanically driven aspect.
And so you have to think about also, if you're playing with some of the things from your old campaign, but you're bringing them into the setting of the new game, and all the things from the new game are there too, how do the things you're bringing in when you're converting affect sort of the meta and the story of the new game?
Yeah, there may be, for example, like, you know, how do these mechanics interact? You know, if you introduced it like a new magic system that wasn't going to be able to be counteracted in the same way, or something like that, that would have a big impact.
Or let's say your monster is a Medusa.
Yeah.
And the system does not have petrification. But you're like, okay, for the story of Medusa, we have to add petrification. We're just going to do it. So you create like a new petrified kind of condition that's just bespoke, and it's in the Medusa, and Medusa can do it. But you might want to look and see, okay, but my system doesn't have an unpetrifying ability because there's no petrification.
So I need to create something
maybe I have like a disenchantment thing that like stops like fairy enchantments and illusions from affecting people, and maybe I should say that also ends petrification.
Yeah.
So that's an example of where you go in and just kind of try to mesh things together, because one of the things we talked about in previous discussions about how new mechanics can lead to issues with cane toad or like foreign elements.
Yeah, that war of escalation where when something something comes in, it doesn't have a counter, or like, you know, but we were talking about the war of escalation in some of our other ones where it's like, you know, this is fire damage. This is immunity to fire damage. This is fire damage that bypasses immunity to fire damage.
This is an immunity that bypasses fire damage to give immunity to fire damage.
Yes, exactly.
This is fire damage that bypasses the immunity to fire, that bypasses the fire damage unless you're also immune to mental effects.
Yes. You don't want to do that. That's just a giant stack of nonsense.
Yes. But escalation aside, cane toad-like effects that just have no counter to them because they weren't meant to be in the system, you can counteract that by thinking carefully when you're the one who's adding the thing to the system about how it should interact with other
features. Alternatively, on the other side, like if you have something that's like, oh yeah, you know, in System 1, this is a really powerful effect that, like, you know, you have to have like 7th level spells to remove, and then in System 2, it's like, yeah, I can get an antidote to this effect in my corner market when I'm level 1. Like, you know, it's not going to be the same sort of feel if the effect is that much weaker. So you might want to think about like what does it mean in that.
And maybe context. It's okay.
Yeah, it could totally
maybe
be
it's
fun.
okay. Like, for example, let's say that you were playing a Pathfinder 2nd edition character that is all focused around like getting permanent flight, which is super powerful in any game system where most things don't have permanent flight. But then you wake up in the future in Starfinder and everybody's got jetpacks and is flying around. Suddenly your permanent flight isn't so powerful in Starfinder.
Yeah. So you might then just want to consider, like, what is the experience like for that player? If it's like a, you know, if it's a short diversion from the main campaign where you go over there and it's like, oh man, this is really different, then that's one thing. But if then they have abilities that feel, compared to the system's paradigm, to be weaker, then you might want to come up with some way to counteract that. It's like, okay, yeah, you know, you invested a lot of resources in getting this flight. Well, maybe that flight should actually cost less resources compared to these other things, and so we'll give you back these feats because
it wouldn't even need to use as many resources.
Because it wouldn't need. It's like, you know, we'll make this cost just the first level feat or whatever. Because like everybody has these types of things most of the time, but you can just have it constantly. And then we'll give you back other resources.
Exactly.
Or whatever.
So you can find a way to make it work out, but maybe for part of the beginning of the story, it's like, wow, I can't believe everyone can fly so easily here.
Or like if you had something that was like a really limited use ability, that you might be able to use it a lot more often in a particular setting. It's like, wow, you know, I've adapted to the way that magic flows differently in this world, and so now I can use it more often.
Yeah, absolutely. So don't be shy about coming up with a narrative explanation for why things change, like the example I gave with the hyperbolic Mythender versus Call of Cthulhu shift. We made it work by putting in a story explanation and a story element to it, rather than just like shoving the character in there with no explanation other than just, well, now you're in this system.
And I think it also depends on whether you're doing the exact same narrative with them. Like, is it literally that character who is moving from that world, from one world to another? Or is it like that you're making a character has the same name, as inspired by that same concept, but isn't literally the same person who would say, yes, before I was in this area and things work this way?
That's right. And maybe they're a planeswalker who just came from another dimension and they're used to this because you play them in every system and they're meant to be the same character. Yeah, this is my 5th weird weird metaphysics system. I always wind up getting reset when I come to these places, and my bag of treasure that's high level from the other thing always drops, just like a character in like the next East sequel where Adol Kristen loses all of his stuff.
Yes. Sometimes for better explanations than others.
Yep. So let's see, we talked about the main principle of converting between tabletop RPGs. Pull a Metro and drop all the pounds down the sewer drain. Yeah, it's exactly that. We talked about the principles of converting. We gave a bunch of examples, and just remember, it doesn't have to be exact. When you get the feel in a different system, that in itself is a huge accomplishment, and you should feel proud of that instead of being like, oh no, but I couldn't do it even more exact than that, because it's not easy to do. And but with these tips, I think you should be able to at least get a start in doing so. Does anyone else in chat have any other questions that you would like to ask us about converting between different tabletop RPGs? And if not, then we will be able to give our goodbye to you.
I do have one other point that we can make while we're waiting to see if chat has any questions. These same principles don't just apply for converting between tabletop RPGs. You can convert between, like, you know, oh, there's a character in a book or movie that I like. Or, oh, but here, let's say you had a card game and we're trying to convert it to a TTRPG. Would that be possible? Oh, have you ever
heard of the Eldemon card game? How would you convert it to Pathfinder 2? Any details? So, like, legitimately, when it comes to Eldemon book that I am writing that has an absurdly large number of elements and play styles, and there's also a card game, that card game and that book are just actually, like, surprisingly interlinked, because I created them. I mean, the card game I'm not going to fully finalize until the book is done, but I have thought about them both from the very beginning. So the classes, Elemental Avatar and Eldemon, have powers that you have to cycle through, and you use each of your powers up to once, and then you have to do a refresh power, which is generally a little less directly aggressive and is kind of a more of a downtime turn than when you're using your main powers, and that gets the powers back, and then you can use them again. So they're not just spam completely at will. So they have a very different playstyle than a kineticist. Well, guess what? You could also represent that by holding the powers in a hand of cards and then discarding them when you use them and picking them back up when you refresh them. So there's definitely... It's going to be even easier than when we talked about the Pathfinder Adventure card game to imagine an Eldemon duel with the card game as being similar to the RPG. Now, there's going to be differences, right? Like, the ice element in the RPG gives movement speed penalties, where it instead gives penalties to the speed of how fast your cards play, which matters because turn order could allow you to do a more powerful combo on your enemy. But there's still going to be a lot of similarities in there.
Yeah.
So but like Linda said, absolutely applies not just with tabletop RPGs to another tabletop RPG, but anything when you're converting. You want to look at the concept, you want to find the essence, and bring that over, rather than being like, it has to be exactly the same in all ways. All right. So let's say goodbye to YouTube, then do our outro and see how the vote has gone. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.